The patients were sick, but the doctor was a sicko. When a small-town physician accidentally swallows experimental bat serum pills, he sued up to his Hippocratic oath in bloodthirsty desire. Transformed into an undead fiend, the doctor finds himself sucked into a dark and sinister world where he must save patients by day and suck their blood at night. That was The Vampire, 1957, 76 minutes. The other feature on here is The Return of Dracula. This is part of the Midnite Movie series from MGM. I really love collecting these. They're tons of fun. I watched both of these the other night back to back. And when you're in the mood for a B movie or a midnight movie, what have you, there's just nothing like finding a good one. I can't describe it. It's just like the best feeling. It's just so much fun. So I wanted to start a series where I talked about these and broke them down. So this video might be a little bit longer. I hope in the future they're not going to be as long. And because basically I want to start with the question, what is a midnight movie? And I know on the Night Watch Zone the other night they did some of the greatest B movies, and they sort of defined it, and it's very loose. A movie, it's like a B side of a record. A B movie, back when the main feature was probably an hour and a half to 2 hours, maybe. There was a feature before that, which could have been anywhere from this one's, you got 76 minutes on here, to an hour and a half tops probably. And people would go to see two movies. So the first one was the one like, okay, if you came in 10 minutes late, you probably weren't missing much. The first one was a B movie, essentially. And then a lot of drive-ins would show those kind of features before the main feature. Maybe there were some drive-ins that had all-night movies. Maybe they flipped it around and they showed the cheaper, lower-budgeted one at midnight, and they sort of became known as midnight movies. It's a very loose sort of description. Sometimes they sort of transcend the label. These are pretty good. I'll tell you why in a moment. You look at this one here. You've got It, The Terror from Beyond Space. And you also have The Monster That Challenged the World. Which I'm a huge fan of. I have the poster of this. And I personally think this is like, right up there in the A category with movies like them when it comes to movies of the era. Sometimes the advertising and marketing will sort of consign a movie to that midnight movie slot or time period, fairly or unfairly. And in my review of the Hammer film, Demons of the Mind, I talked about how they didn't know how to market it, and they paired it up with a slasher movie, and it might not have been the best fit. Sometimes, like, for example, The Monster That Challenged the World, in the trailer, they made it seem like there was a giant monster, like a Godzilla-sized monster. He's not that big. It's scary enough for me, especially when I saw it as a kid. But sometimes they would shoot themselves in the foot with the marketing and so forth, and make their film appear that it was something that it wasn't. In a quick. Well, you guys know the deal. They're trying to grab cash, and sometimes movies were described unfairly. So we would never really be talking about any mainstream horror movies. We're not talking about any of the Universal monsters, Wolfman, Dracula, anything like that. We could also be talking about, movies that were popular in their era in the 70s. You had a lot of motorcycle chase type films. Here's two with Peter Fonda. Let's just get to it. Let's get to the review of these two films. First, The Vampire. The scientist is played by John Beale. I wasn't really familiar with any of these actors, really. There's another scientist played by Dabbs Greer. That name. You're not going to forget a name like that. I kind of recognized him. And then on IMDb, I saw pictures of him when he was older. So yeah, I've seen him in plenty of stuff. And then Colleen Gray plays a nurse who's very sympathetic to and friendly with the doctor, John Beale. She's like really well cast. She's like pretty, but she's like small town pretty. She's not like super glamorous. And her last credit, by the way, was a Tales from the Dark Side episode. And then you got Kenneth Tobey. Anytime I see him in a movie like this, it just, I get happy. He was on a lot of sci-fi horror movies in the 50s. The Thing from Another World, probably most well known. One of the other Ray Harryhausen creature features. Then later he would play a lot of authority figures and police officers, and Joe Dante would stick him in movies, as he often did. And as a matter of fact, Kenneth Tobey appears in Dirty Mary, Crazy Larry, which is pretty cool, as a police officer. So let's get into the plot. You have basically a nice small town setting, environment, where you have, in the beginning, a young lad is riding around on a bicycle. He's got a basket with like a portable zoo, he calls it, something like that. And he basically collects animals and brings them to this doctor, an eccentric doctor who lives in a creepy house. And he goes in there to drop off some animals, and there's all kinds of rabbits and things in cages. And the doctor's slumped over. Well, they get the town doctor, medical doctor, and the sheriff, and he's dead. And a couple days later, the only animals that aren't dead are the bats. There's a cage full of bats. And the doctor, they realize he was working on some kind of serum. Anyway, the town doctor, played by John Beale, gets a hold of these pills. And he eventually, I forget if he takes one first and it has kind of an effect on him and he doesn't like it. So he puts them away. And then later, he's like a single dad with like this really spunky, 12-year-old daughter. 12 to 15, somewhere in there. Later, he has a migraine, so he asks for the pills, and she gives him the wrong one. And that causes him to sort of turn into a creature. We'll get into that in a moment. And then he starts to question whether or not he's the one responsible for a spate of killings. And it's interesting because, of course, they went for the vampire as the title. Well, I guess it sort of overlaps with the vampire legend a little bit because of the bats, and he transforms at night, around midnight or so. But then the special effects, the way he actually looks and acts kind of more like Mr. Hyde, like Jekyll and Hyde. Kind of hunched over, and there's some pretty good shots of him running in the moonlight, and I guess they messed his hair up, but he's kind of has this funny run, and he's running after people, and later you see his face, and it's kind of hideous looking. Not the greatest special effects ever. You typically don't get that level of special effects in a film like this, but he definitely reminds you more of Mr. Hyde. And yet, as he begins to realize that, hey, I might be the one responsible for all this, it's a very sympathetic portrayal, and it reminds you of the Larry Talbot character from The Wolfman. He's like, oh, woe is me. I need to stop. Somebody needs to put me out of my misery before I kill again. And it's a really good performance by John Beale. I was very surprised by that. And at one point, he tells his daughter, you might have to go live with your aunt for a while. I'm not so, and she's pretty upset about it. She goes, well, who would make you, your pancakes in the morning, Daddy? And it's kind of tragic. And his nurse, played by Colleen Gray, agrees to sort of help him, to keep an eye on him, to keep the pills away from him, but he just can't help himself. At one point, he tricks her, gets a hold of the pills, and you're introduced to many side characters, including an old woman walking her dog at midnight. What's going to happen to her? So he gets out again, and it basically, plot-wise, it's not. I'm not going to tell you anything that you can't figure out. I mean, I could spoil the ending, but I think you know what's going to happen. It's a tragic story. What distinguishes this is actually the performances and how heartfelt it is. It's actually a pretty good movie, and I do kind of like the way that it borrowed from Jekyll and Hyde, the Wolfman, and the Vampire. That was actually kind of cool. Just know what you're getting into. You're not getting into a straight vampire movie, a typical one. Yeah, this is really good. Variety said it had tense direction and builds steadily in suspense. Now, the next film, The Return of Dracula, is a minute longer, 77 minutes, from 1958, the year after. And I'm just looking at the similarities here. Both directed... Oh, yeah, they had like a factory going here. Both directed by Paul Landris. Both story and screenplay by Pat Fielder. Same producer, Jules V. Levy. Yeah, everything's almost the same, really, as far as the production of these films. They just said... they cranked them out, I guess. They did Vampire, and then they said, heck, let's do another movie. This time, let's put Dracula in the title. The Return of Dracula. I don't believe anyone uses the phrase Dracula in The Return of Dracula, they do use the phrase vampire, and the vampire in this one is closer to the traditional vampire, but I don't think you see any fangs. But they do borrow some aspects of it, including the mirror, the whole reflection deal. But I'll get into that in a minute. Let's take a look. Ready? Unholy terror? Count on it in this well-made, tightly directed fright fest, says Variety, about sucking the blood out of the tourist trade. When Dracula, Francis Lederer, pulls up stakes from his native Europe and flees across the Atlantic, he tries to fit in by posing as the cousin of an unsuspecting American family. But when he starts sinking his teeth into every red-blooded thing California has to offer, he soon turns the Golden State into the Ghoulish State. Okay, once again, I don't think they call him Dracula in the movie one time, and I don't know what they mean by the tourist trade, really. I don't remember any tourists. So this guy, Francis Lederer, plays this vampire who's escaping Europe, and he's on a train with a gentleman who talks about living in this town with a cave behind it, and he basically describes his whole life. And Dracula eliminates that guy and then assumes his identity, and it's actually a pretty good scene when the train pulls in. You know, small town America back then. You had a cousin from Europe coming named, oh, what was his name? It wasn't Bella, but it was close. It was close to that. That was kind of interesting, you know. When he shows up, his, I think it's his sister and her daughter, and there's a boyfriend involved. The boyfriend's like, oh, you know, less time with my girlfriend. But the niece of the person he's impersonating is so excited just because it's just spicing things up a little bit, and she likes to paint, and he's supposed to be an artist, you know. So he gets as the train pulls in, they're collecting all the tickets and everything, and there's a coffin, and the guy has turned himself into mist, and then he reappears right in front of the family and says, "Oh, I'm your cousin so and so," and then he basically goes home with them, and then there's a few awkward moments where he doesn't really know everything about the person he's impersonating, but he managed to get around it. And that's basically the story. You know, people start to disappear. There's actually another tragic film, really, sad scene where the one young lady has a friend who's blind. She goes to her and reads to her and everything, and the guy's like, "Oh, a blind girl, huh? Yeah, she'll make an easy victim." It's like, good Lord, yo, buddy. I mean, yeah, he's a vampire. He's not a nice guy. But what distinguishes this film is in the beginning of the film, you see a group of guys, and I believe a couple of them have crosses. They open up a crypt, or go into a mausoleum and open up a crypt, and it's empty. And they're like, oh, darn. So then they show up later. And that reminds me of the vampire hunters from Vampires. There's actually a lot of similarities. It's really kind of interesting. And later the guy, what does the guy say? He actually shows ID, one guy, and he says it's supposed to be like Interpol, but it's like the European Police Commission. It's just this generic title. And the family's like, oh, sure, come on in. We'll tell you all our business. Sure. But, first one guy shows up and does like an investigation, and he actually, everybody smokes back then, so he takes out a lighter and he aims it at the vampire, Uncle Vampire, and takes a picture, and he reports to his boss, and he goes, I don't think that's the guy, because he's asking him all these questions, and the guy's answering him. And then later on, of course, they develop the film, and there's no picture. It's pretty clever. I mean, it's pretty cool. And, some of the vampire hunters are then hunted by the vampire, and then the senior guy has to sort of get involved. And I won't really say anymore. I mean, you can kind of guess how it ends, but it's it's pretty good. Again, low budget, lots of like misting effects, and the vampire will appear out of thin air. I don't even remember if you see any fangs. I don't think you do. You do see like bite marks. You know, he'll come back a second time. Sometimes just you'll see a couple different pairs of bite marks. But again, it's really a pretty decent movie. I really enjoyed it. Maybe not quite as much as The Vampire, but it's pretty close. Definitely, like this is a really good double feature here. I highly recommend it. Anyway, have you heard of either one of these things? What are your thoughts? Let me know in the comments below. But come back again soon. I couldn't help myself. I was curious. I had to watch Jesse James Meets Frankenstein's Daughter, and I paired that up with another movie, which I thought I made my own pairing this time. They're not on this compilation, but thematically I thought they went well together, and I watched both of those. Oh brother. Oh boy, did I pick a couple winners there, boy.
And one more thing, guys. As I'm editing the video here, I discovered that Sean from the Movie Assault channel has actually reviewed Vampire, which is kind of cool because not many people have seen this film, let alone reviewed it. So please go ahead and check out his channel and his review of this film. It's a lot shorter than mine, and he gets right to the point. And he actually mentions a character who's like a sidekick to the Dabs Greer character, who is just like a strange character. It's like a bizarre character. I didn't even mention him, so please go ahead and check out his review for some additional insight into this film.
But that'll be the next review, so come back again for another Midnite Movie review. And thanks a lot. Later.